Do you see the?
Yep.
Okay, so as usual, before the start of the talk, I'm going to introduce the Tugba and her talk and the talk that will be held next week. So the next talk will be held by Graia Badescu from the University of Constance. Will be welcomed by Richard Peragine, one of the students who participated to the organization of this cycle of conference. The talk by Badescu will discuss how memorialization practices of sites of political violence in different post-war and post-authoritarian geographical settings have circulated on a transnational level through connected processing and actors. I would like to remember to the audience that this talk is not going to be held on May 19th as previously communicated, but on Monday, May 17th at 5 p.m. Italian time. Perfect. So I'm going now to introduce Tugba. Tugba is a PhD ABD in Global Urban Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, in New Jersey, United States. She also works as a research assistant with Professor Jack Chen on multiple projects around climate change and justice in occupied Mont Lenape territory, also known as the Greater New York region. She's also part of a research team for the upcoming International Anti-Eugenics Conference in New York City this summer, and she is currently working on several publications on these topics. For this distant talk, Tugba is going to describe her research and the question topic that she is working on. Her research lies in the intersection of place attachment, climate change, and forced displacement, including human beings as well non-human beings, namely plant, animals, and other environmental elements. She will try to construct a new definition or a new meaning that challenges the traditional approaches dealing with the understanding and description of human and non-human displaced beings. Her research is grounded on the colonial thinking in order to open up, and this allows her to open up a discussion about the use of storytelling and the roles of emotion in fostering new processes of knowledge production. She will describe the categories of refugees, and the goal of this talk is to debunk and problematize them. This is expected to be a collective effort achieved during and after the presentation through the engagement of the audience. So Tugba will make questions and will engage the audience throughout the presentation in order to collectively start to problematize and debunk the category of refugees as we are used to know in the historical terms. So if you want to share the screen, Tugba.
Thank you so much for this introduction. So before we begin, I wanted to thank you, all of you, for making this time and providing me this space to open up a discussion around my subject, because in a way we all, lacks this kind of environment to receive peer-to-peer feedbacks and peer-to-peer interaction. And I believe these kind of opportunities are great ways to produce knowledge, basically, because the colonial thinking and the way we thought about producing knowledge is somehow problematic, and it's not satisfying the current needs. So I really appreciate for providing me this space. So let me share my screen. All right. I believe you can see the screen without any issues. So great. Today, I'm going to open up a conversation around climate migration and its relation to place to explore how the human faces of climate change reshape their belonging upon displacement. So this conversation will be more about a journey of me finding my voice to explore an intersection that emerges when climate migration and place-centric research meets. So I named this research as Understanding the Role of Place on Climate Migrants' Home Processes Upon Displacement. And here I use the home in the form of verb because my research calls a definition that emphasizes the fact that home is an act of making rather than a static entity. So before we begin, I wanted to briefly guide you through this conversation to give you a framework to follow. So even though my research is still in its very early periods, I wanted to share with you how I discovered and rediscovered basically with different lenses the same subject to challenge and shift the focus in order to craft a proposal basically. Because right now I'm crafting my dissertation proposal and hoping to defend soon. So I will do it by focusing on the journey through the literature that I'm most familiar with to assist you to ground the abstraction that I have right now. So to do that, I will begin with raising a few questions to be able to open up an interactive conversation, as Marco mentioned, to ground climate change with your stories, because I believe stories tell us more than, just words. I mean, they're telling us something. They're helping us to understand the subject and making the subject relatable. So then I will share the very essence of my thinking process and the way I narrowed down my study. And I will do it by sharing what I know already, the gaps and the discoveries that I had. And lastly, I will share my research questions to contextualize and wrap up my talk basically. So since this is a work in progress, please do not hesitate to share your feedbacks with me. I believe this is a great opportunity to explore my research with the help of my peers. So, as I mentioned, I wanted to ask a few questions to uncover the way we think about climate change, displacement, and storytelling. So these are not like yes/no questions. There is no right or wrong answers to them, and they're in a very vague format. I did it intentionally because I didn't want to frame your thinking in a way. So I will show these questions at the end as well. So if you want to jump in right now, you're more than welcome. But if you need time to think about, you can always take your time. So the first question I have is, how has climate change, displacement influenced your life, basically? And the second question is that what comes to your mind when you hear the word migration, quote unquote migration? And what are the stories that you have been hearing about climate change? And how do you relate these questions with your own experiences? Because mostly when we think about climate change and when we are asked to think about climate change, we tend to narrow down the subject with sea level rise or all this scientific knowledge that we are bombarded with. But I encourage you and I invite you to think about this subject in a very humanistic way so that we can, find roots within this subject. So this is basically, before I begin, if you want to share anything right now, please jump in. If not, no worries.
I think everyone is able to unmute by their own. Pretty sure about it.
People may need time. Sorry, so no worries. So this is basically how the literature looked like when I first familiarized myself with this subject, which is about climate migration and people's place attachment in times of displacement. So I centered climate change and place-centric research as two main literatures and hope to find an intersection to position my initial thoughts, which was about understanding the role of feeling of place attachment on climate migrants' relocation decisions. As I unpack these two big bubbles, I realized that there are only a few studies that actually intersect these seemingly independent entities. And I realized that while studies on climate change explore scientific ways to slow down climate change with a very hardcore data-driven research, Place-centric research mostly deal with subjects around sense of belonging, place attachment, place identity, forced displacement, emotional attachment, etc., etc. And during this exploration process, I finally spotted a point in the seemingly independent subjects, and that is the relationship we had with the more than human aspects of the story. And that's why I circled them with the red in red color, because in climate change, we see that we see some studies around more than human relocation and extinction. And I mean for more than humans, like plants, animals, or like the nature itself. So for the place-centric research, I realized there is this tendency to ground this research on landscape. So I intersected these two basically bubbles with the idea of chosen place. So by chosen place, I mean the local built and natural environment that provide us to nurture a relationship with our surrounding. A space to exchange stories about the change, basically. So, oops, let me here. Yes, okay. So based on my research, I listed the things that I know about climate migration trends. So based on that, I basically in a way, I justified the significance of my research. So the first thing we know is that if we keep following the same old approach, World Bank claims that we will have approximately 143 million climate migrants / refugees by 2050. And this population will emerge only from 3 regions: Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. So as a way to contextualize this problem, during the latest refugee crisis, the Syrian civil war, please correct me if I'm wrong, but approximately 750,000 Syrian refugees entered the US, EU territories, and this has shaken the EU significantly. So now imagine a refugee population close to 200 million people scattering around the world just to survive, just to find a refuge. So the conflicts that will come with this change is beyond our imagination. But we can, list some of them as like very broad and vague. We can frame that with very vague terms, basically. There will be adaptation problems, there will be security-related problems, there will be cultural disengagement, and it will lead to chaos, basically. So even without thinking about 30 years later, we know that there are communities affected by the destructive environmental impacts of climate change. And these communities, as you can imagine, are mostly part of the low-income communities. They're people of color, they're from native nations, they're Pacific Islander communities. So these impacted communities are not only losing their home, but they're also losing their cultural identities. They're surfacing they're actually losing generational knowledge, their roots. So, but the discussion is highly concentrated on tangible impacts of the change, because whenever we talk about climate change impacts and upcoming climate migration trends, we always centralize this subject around like, how should we divide the budget? What are the adaptation strategies? How we can, help people to move securely and successfully, and how the economy will be impacted by this change, etc., etc. So shortly, we see that mostly climate change impacts intangible forms. And the last realization I had was about the term itself, a problem that is just like a chicken egg problem, I believe, because when I try to lean on the existing literature, I realized that there is no definition for climate refugees. Since there is no definition, there is basically no data about whereabouts of these people. And we don't have any data because we don't have any definition. So this is a very interesting problem for me to discover. And this, in a way, this helped me in a way to realize that we adopted a definition as if it's part of a whole script that cannot be changed, that cannot be challenged. And since we don't have any definition, we cannot, we cannot understand these people's struggles because we're not giving a space for them to talk about their struggles, basically. So then I searched, quote unquote, this whole script to understand the term refugee and the context that is produced, basically. So as you may know, basically this term crafted in 1951 for a post-World War II European context, basically. So this very context and time-oriented term remains the same even after 70 years. So, but we know that, the world is not the same. So we need an upgrade, we need a new definition, we need a new approach to understand what does refugee mean in our current climate. So then I questioned the way we think about the definitions we have in our disposal. Like in my case, I am thinking about what does migration mean? What does place attachment mean? How can I challenge these terms to make it, to contextualize it based on the conditions that we have right now. So, and this breaking point basically helped me to start challenging the colonial thinking that we exposed to throughout our whole education life. Then I saw this map. So this map shows how does the climate migration look like in more than human side of the story, basically. This map inspired me in so many ways that I finally grounded my research in intangible impacts of climate change on beings in general. So, which means that this includes human and more than human aspect of this story and the relationship we develop with our surrounding, basically. And also this led me to surface again how colonial thinking and rigidness that comes with it has shaped and influenced the way I think about climate migration so far. And this surfacing in return, helped me to look inward and find roots in indigenous thinking while diving into the rabbit hole we call literature in academia, basically. So when I turned myself towards the intangible impacts of climate change, I realized that these are the impacts that are hidden behind the scene. These are impacts that are, forced to remain behind the scene and excluded from the discussion. So as I explored more and more, I realized that forced displacement can cause emotional reactions to the trauma associated with climate change. And it can trigger reactions like depression, anxiety, hopelessness, homesickness, anger, grief, fear. There are many layers of these very, complex web of emotions, basically. And in the end, all of these emotional reactions eventually lead to climate denial or inaction. But denial or inaction is not only amplified by emotional stress. I realized that the narrative around climate change is overwhelmingly scientific. It's really hard to understand and mostly scary, basically. So in a way, we're enforcing an alienation by making the subject intimidating for people. So I think it is just like telling a child to save money every single day until their 20s, or else they will be poor in their 20s. So when you overwhelm and intimidate the child this way, you're just increasing the stress level and you're making the child feel guilty for the days they didn't save any money. So this constant exposure to stress and pressure eventually paralyzes them. And it is more or less the same when we talk about climate change. So what I am trying to do is to making this subject understandable for quote unquote regular people. That's why I am hoping to utilize storytelling as a medium to unpack how people are actually grounding climate change in their everyday life. So this analogy made me also realize that the rigid science is not targeting the quote unquote ordinary people as it targets only the decision bodies. Yet in order to incentivize people to take action for climate change, we need to root the conversation in the community. And one of the best ways of doing it through utilizing storytelling, because storytelling helps making the subject relatable, and it helps us to feel heard, seen, and basically relevant. So this is why if we make a space for story exchanging, the ecological grief can contribute to development of pro-environmental behaviors, basically, among human faces of climate migration. And this is basically how I framed my method to conduct this study. All right, so in the end, I grounded my research through these questions. So the first research question I have is that how does chosen place help climate migrants to heal in the context of climate change? And as a follow-up question I had is that how does the chosen place help human faces of climate change to heal from the ecological grieving? And the last leading research question I have is how does human faces of climate change describe climate migration, and how can their description influence the local community to take action basically? So here, chosen place refers to the encounter spaces basically that are designated by the communities that offer a sense of refuge, serenity, a place to feel vulnerable basically. And this way I hope to discover these places as I conduct my research with the help of research participants, or I really would like to call them my co-researchers. So in the end, my research looks like this. So there are these three big circles intersecting and helping me to nourish my research that will hopefully bloom to discover stories around climate migration in people's designated safe havens, pretty much. So in this very intersecting point, although I'm calling it a point, it's a whole, I think, different story in my case, because that point opens up a whole new world for me to challenge all these definitions with the help of people, so that, you know, I can understand how people are actually thematizing or like describing the academic terms like migration or like place attachment or place itself. So to wrap up, I try to cover 3 main sections basically. So in the first section, I asked this question like, how does the literature look like when I first began to begin my research interest basically. So here I explain like how I explored the rigidness in my research and how I distance myself to find my voice basically. And in the second part, I tried to explain how did I frame my research and how I detached myself from the colonial thinking and how this detachment helped me to discover behind the scene part of my research. So in the end, all these discoveries and all these processes led me to frame my research for me to move forward. And here I basically explain how I reframe the literature and how I ground my thinking. So going back to the questions that I highlighted in the very beginning, I wanted to show them again, and I wanted to ask you the way you define migration, basically, the way you define refugees, and the way you experience the issues that, you know, that surrounds you around these subjects. So if you have any questions or if you want me to expand more some parts of this discussion, please let me know. I'm happy to do so. So thank you so much.
Thanks to you. So, okay. So if anyone want to participate or to tell something about the question that Tugba showed us. Wait, you can just re-put maybe them on the to share the screen with the questions.
Oh, sure.
So we have them there, or we can see them.
Sure.
I have I mean, maybe it's just a very silly comment, but I was surprised that in your literature, I mean, in the framing of your literature, there was no reference to, I mean, let's say migration in relation to capitalism, in the sense that if I think of out of my own experience, like, I mean, it's obviously not comparable to, like, let's say hardcore migration and forced migration, but like just from working abroad or moving around, and let's call that like migration for work, let's say. Like one thing that I felt was that like my migration was pretty much impacting on the environment simply because maybe I was, you know, flying. So I was wondering how, like in your study so far, how you kind of thought of capitalism, or let's say contemporary capitalism. Yeah, so maybe this, I mean, maybe it's silly and it's not really relevant to your work, but
to be honest, I never thought about it. Thank you so much for this comment, because I was so interested in, you know, how people are moving around, especially in terms of their forced displacement. I never connected these two really important notes, basically. Thank you so much. I will definitely look into that.
Thank you for the talk.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Tugba, for a wonderful presentation. Learned so much, And I was also interested in the chicken and egg problem that you mentioned on that there was no definition of climate refugee. And of course, because of that, there's no data. And I'm just wondering if how you would go about defining climate refugee in order for you to collect that data in a sense that, because I know you've also mentioned like this emotional problems that they also face because of displacement. And I'm also wondering if that's also the reason why there isn't any title of climate refugee, because they're all bunched in one definition of all the different factors they face. So I'm just wondering how you would go about creating that definition for yourself.
To be honest, I'm still trying to figure out, and I'm still trying to create a definition, because as you already mentioned, I mean, although one of the main reasons for their relocation is related to climate change, they still cannot make their cases based on that problem. So they, based on my knowledge, I know that when asylum seekers are making their cases, especially if they're coming from Latin America that are impacted by climate change, they're making the cases based on the problems other than climate change.
Yeah.
Because it's still not a valid, reason for them to apply for asylum.
Right.
So this is an obstacle for me that I need to overcome, because I'm still trying to, figure out how can I challenge and come up with a definition so that I can convince people, because these are very, rooted terms. It's really hard to challenge it. It's really hard to find a way to incorporate new aspects of the term into that very definition. So
right. Yeah, and the questions you have here will elucidate that, in a sense, to gathering more storytelling as your method. Yeah. Thank you, Tugba.
Thank you so much, Christina.
If I can, I would like to, well, it's not a question, it's more a reflection, because I'm currently working on refugees as well. Well, not climate change refugees, but still, like what you stress that is so important is that, and what I'm reading right now is that some literature gives refugees for granted. So they come and they're refugees, but this path, because it's a path, it's a becoming thing, because you're born in a place where you need to be ready to move. I mean, it's this, like, I have Abdul Malik Simone's eco, that he mentions this state of preparedness. So you need to you create mentally another something that you need to reach. So even where you live, you already give that place as something that you will live anyway. So that it's like so that's something that you really stressed, and I'm so happy that you also stressed the role of storytelling and how it's like how it gives well, you said well, I forgot the exact word you said, but it was very relevant, that it gives reliability. Storytelling, that it's like the real experience that comes out from, I guess it's really important, because like as scholars sometimes we have this, let's say, broader view, I don't know how to say that, but detached view, let's say so. So it was, I mean, your talk was really inspiring, and I hope that, well, thanks Marco, I hope that we will keep the conversation maybe another time, because we have this common, let's say, theme.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much for these great comments. I mean, I realized the same, basically the issue, because I am reading about the ongoing displacement that are happening in Labrador, in Canada, that are happening in, let's say, Sweden, in Sami lands, in Aboriginal communities in Australia. But I realized that these stories although they're super relevant, there is no ground for them to share and, you know, make the issue more striking for everyone to understand the seriousness of this problem. So I think this gave me the strength that I need to conduct my research, because I am really interested in making a ground for us to make this issue relatable, because otherwise we will keep doing, you know, we will keep publishing papers and it will basically will very little impact on the actual people who are impacted by this change. So thank you so much.
Okay, if anyone wants to go, I have a couple of comments. Otherwise, it will be like the final one, or like I can wait if anyone else wants to join. Okay, I'm going. There will be time after me in case. Okay, so I have two comments. I don't know how to define them, and they are related, of course, on your presentation. And thanks for you for doing it, of course. And they are related on the first and the third question here, kind of. So the first part is that, at least in my own experience as a Italian guy who lives in Italy and spends some time in the US and so on and so on, like basically I cannot say that climate change is impacting me, at least relatively speaking, to the ways in which climate change could impact someone. And therefore, in a sense, it comes to my mind like this idea that in general, especially like for a researcher, we're studying something like that. So like it's, for me, like climate change is something that I decided to fight more than something that I had to deal with, okay, with my personal choices. So to avoid to use car, or I don't know, to do not eat meat, or this kind of action that are individual. Like I think that, of course, you cannot fight climate change by yourself, but if you don't start by yourself, nothing will never change, right? So I'm not blaming myself for climate change, but at the same time, I need to be the part of the solution, right? And so in this sense, it comes to me that maybe it's a matter of positionality, in a sense, like considering also like the decolonial thinking, how positionality is central in this kind of reasoning, right? And therefore, like I think it's something like positionality in the research of refugee, and in definition, like every definition you use is something political. It comes to me like this is not possible to detach climate change research from the political dimensions that impregnate everything around it, right? Like there isn't like there is no political impermeability in climate change. Everything happened, like both the most natural thing that could happen in climate change, the sea level rise, floods, everything is political. So like how can we deal with this kind of positionality, especially considering our privilege of being, on the right side of the world, in a sense. It's from not the right side, but the safer side of the world, in a sense, because Europe for now is not affected in a dramatic way from climate change. And this is like how do you deal with this constant discussion about your own positionality? And this is the first. And the second thing related to it, because I think it's interesting, and I'm dealing in a sense with the same problems about the human non-human. You can frame this discussion about the two things in different ways, based basically on the literature that you are referring to when you think about this. But my idea is this: if you when you basically rediscover the political dimension of nature, or like you start to like some literature start to politicize nature, do you think that like is affecting how like natural sciences are dealing with climate change, and like in the public discourse, how climate change is constructed, not only in science but also like in the news and whatever, is constructed as a political issue, and consequently how the people who are like displaced and forcibly displaced because of it treated as political beings, and how their situation is politicized in a decolonial way, not only like in saying, like in the racist rhetorics that, like, I mean, like we live in Italy and I used to live in the US. I mean, it's like the discrimination on this, like against refugees is, pretty hardcore on the both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So
first of all, I have no solid reason, and I can only speculate because, as you already mentioned, these are very, in a way, political discussions. So that's why I mean, in a way, I am entitled to position myself in a depoliticized way. So, but also before that, I wanted to point out something. I think it's really interesting because while you were talking about your capability within the discussion of climate change, you said that, you specifically use the term blame. So you feel like, you feel guilty in a way that, you feel lonely and you feel like incapable of doing things and starting to change things within your limitations. So I think one way of doing and, challenging this discourse is to basically talk about it. I mean, of course, you have limited opportunities, you have limits, and it is not expected from you to make the change. But if you feel part of this conversation with the help of community, that's why I am trying to make this subject with a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down strategy, because I believe one way of, I think contextualizing the issue is through the help of community. So I'm not sure if I answer your question correctly for the first one, but for the second question, you're right. I mean, we're politicizing the nature basically right now with our research, with the way we approach the literature, the way we approach the nature itself. I mean, we are not relying on indigenous knowledge. This is a huge mistake right now, because they are the people who know the land. They are the people who know how to approach the land holistically. And we keep ignoring because, the colonial thinking enforces us to, glorify the northern way of thinking. So that's why I'm hoping to rely on, I think, indigenous literature more, so that I can, shift the enforced perspective for this discussion.
yeah, related to my first question was not more about me, like it was just a way to introduce the question about like how in the literature that you are problematizing and in the ways in which you're thinking about it, how can you, like the individual, like in the storytelling part, like basically the storytelling is a very individualistic method in a sense. And then of course there is the political stuff that like climate change is not a personal responsibility and is not like a personal blame, of course. I mean, not for ordinary people at least. but did you get my question? So like how like the connection between the two things, like how. But yeah, but you answered it, of course. Like
I can, if you can give me time, I can answer that question as well.
yeah, of course, yeah. Does anyone else want to contribute or to share something? Share their opinions, ideas. Okay, you have another question. because like in a sense, like it's very similar and very close to the topics that I'm dealing with, even if I'm not like tackling climate change so directly. Like the things that you're using and you're basing your work on are pretty similar to mine. So it's very interesting for me to, to share and to see how other people are working on this kind of stuff. So like in a sense, um, like there is like it's kind of a weird question. I don't know if it makes sense, but in a sense, like the kind of literature that you're like both based on and problematizing at the same time, like how do they manage to understand like the human beings into the relationship, and in problematizing the dichotomy between being the producer of climate change or the responsible for climate change and simultaneously the victims of it, in a sense. So like to be both the cause and the one that suffers from the consequences of it. I don't know if it makes sense, my question, but it's hard.
So I think based on my exploration, I can say that, I didn't find any paper that explains, how we're part of the problem and how we're basically part of the solution. But the way they explored climate change in human-centric research is basically through mental health. So they're conducting interviews with people who are, impacted by climate change already, especially around Labrador Inuit communities, Inuit native communities, and they're finding these connections, how this changing climate basically influencing the way they develop relationship with the nature, and how this constant exposure is basically forcing them to move, but how they feel lonely about this subject. So it's not like, it's not like writing about, climate change is something that we're all part of it. The narrative is completely different for now.
Thank you.
I think I received a question from Renato. Renato, if you don't mind, may I read your question? I think it won't be a problem. So he asked me, so in the beginning, my research was basically focusing on Houston and New Orleans, basically, especially for the communities that are impacted by Hurricane Harvey and Katrina. And I was hoping to, find how they're basically relocating and what are the things that they face with during this relocation processes. And his question is relevant to that. He asked me how I changed my team. So basically, I changed my team because, as I already mentioned, there's no basically data about their relocation processes. We know that, there are like maybe 100,000 people relocated because of Hurricane Katrina, but we don't know exactly where they are right now. And same applies to Hurricane Harvey. After Hurricane Harvey happened, Houston, maybe 1/3 of Houston was demolished during this event, and it led it actually gave birth to climate migration within this region, but we don't know where they are right now. And the only way to track them, and I think it's still not very solid way to trace climate migrants' roots, because they're tracing how school districts received application from different communities. This is one way of tracing it right now, but this applies only to US context, and I'm not sure, how they're tracing people in other countries. So this led me to basically rethink about my research and the limits of it.
Any other question? Well, I mean, if anyone wants to say anything else, I think we can stop here the recording and the discussion. Is it okay? It's okay, Tugba?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wait, just let me stop the recording here.